truly my passion in life is writing software and taking photos and traveling. And all of those have an intersection that comes together in trying to understand the human condition. And if, as we all do, you enjoy writing software, then that intersection of humanity and culture and computing is, to me, incredibly fascinating. But I'm equally humbled that anyone turned up today, because a quick review of the literature shows that localization is not really the hot topic in computer science, even necessarily in any other field of computing. Yet I was very conscious in my thinking that the ElixirConf EU would be a much better vehicle for having this conversation, because of course, each of you in your own way lives far more than I ever have in political, social, and cultural environments that overlap and intersect, and which on the surface might seem the same, but are of course very, very different. And I have had the distinct pleasure of living in quite a large number of parts of the world, and I have never lost my fascination for trying to understand what does that actually mean. But when we get down to the practical part of localization and internationalization, I'd like to think that our objective, at least my personal objective, is to make it as easy as possible to write software which can adapt to the preferences of the individual consumer, whether that's writing software for a single culture and region, or whether you truly have global aspirations. And that's been a driving intent of mine all the way through the now 6-year journey. So we're going to cover quite a lot of ground this morning, and I hope a reasonably good pace, but there's no way we're going to cover the end to end. So I do want to note that, prompted by this opportunity, I've got a number of other thoughts about talks, topics, and live books that can eventually get us to the point of having a full stack live view application, applying all of the knowledge and techniques that I've learned and all of the feedback, ideas, and suggestions that I've got from what is truly a wonderful community and a reason really why Elixir is something that I really enjoy. So yes, I do work in IT, but not as an engineer. And so I just want to be really, really clear. This talk, its content, and any software I've built is completely unrelated to my employment. This journey started in 2016 when I had to look that up by looking at the repo, because I truly didn't know when I started, and I'm amazed it's been now 6 years. And it started because way back when Jose was even on the core team of Ruby and Rails, I got interested in internationalization. And so I thought, when I came to Elixir following Jose, a little bit late, I thought, okay, this is a good way to learn the language, because localization at its core is a lot of data. And Elixir's really good at data. So let me have a weekend's play with that, see if I can do anything. And somehow, 6 years later, here we are. And I've probably dedicated 4 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day for those 6 years, and loved every single moment of it, except when bug reports come in at 3 a.m. because that's just what it is. It turns out also, having the name that I have, which is in fact my name, although like most names, it's a bit more complicated than that, always amusing when I visit the Netherlands, given that I see my name over the shop fronts of every shop in Amsterdam. It's a little unusual when I go to the fabulous country of Lao, because it's the unit of currency and it means ticket in Japanese. So every train station, my name is mentioned all the time, and it confuses me. And of course, in London, it's mostly to do with having a sleep. So maybe that gives me some credibility to have this conversation. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on definitions. I think intuitively everyone understands the intent here is to represent and present and consume information in a manner that is appropriate to the user of that software. And when it's expressed that way, and I think it's true, it starts to, people's eyes start to glaze over. Oh my God, I've got to think about very complicated things. You know, I have enough trouble already trying to disambiguate a date. I'm really not sure, do I put a comma as the grouping separator in a number, and is the decimal point? Which country does that number come from, and what does that actually mean? And it doesn't need to be that complicated. And that's my overall objective, to suggest that we can go a very long way down developing and delivering applications without too much effort. And a lot of that really is due to what Elixir brings to the party. At its core, given that we're just talking about data, Elixir is really good at transforming data. And it also turns out that the source of that data, which we're going to use from the CLDR repository, lends itself to a great deal of metaprogramming. I don't think there's a single macro in the whole family of libraries, but there is a ton of metaprogramming, which just fits so beautifully and naturally in there. But my overall theme here is that even if you are writing an application for a single culture or a single territory, you are in fact localizing. It's just that as developers, we've come to accept that we write software in American English. And I've done my best today, and I can see one place I've failed already, to use British English spelling because that's what I grew up with in Australia. And I thought today that's what I would do because that represents my preferences and interests. But I've slipped up in the middle of this page, and it probably isn't the last time either. If you're in the business of writing commercial software to engage with audiences, you know already localization, amongst many other factors, also improves customer engagement, which has a direct contribution to bottom line delivery, to cart fills and to checkout rates and to overall order values if you're in commerce. So I do think that there are both social, cultural, and economic reasons why this is a topic that should be more popular and isn't. And interestingly, when you take a scan of the books on Amazon, there's very few books you can buy, and they're usually $200 and $300 and in hardback and not even on Kindle. So if I can engender even a small renaissance in localization, I think we deliver a better user experience and we make software more fun. After all, how many times have you seen questions on the forum that says, is there a way I can format this number with grouping digits of 3? Or is there a way that I can parse this date or produce a date in a format that I care about? That's just localization, and it doesn't need to be scary. Well, we're going to start pretty much from the foundational level in this talk. So if anyone's arrived here today thinking, where's my full stack live view demo example, I should apologize. And I totally accept that if you abandon at this point and come back later on. But if we start at the start, why I think localization has become more complex than it should be is that we have not been very good as an industry identifying how we would like our user to communicate their preferences. And we've also got a degree of arrogance that says, it's okay, I know better than you do what you want. And I think that clash is at the intersection of why we make this more difficult. Let's look at the most obvious example. A user joins to our web application or our mobile application, and we need to make some assumptions about what that user's locale is, what their culture is, language, and other preferences. And I think back to the many examples in visiting Europe, one in particular, visiting Munich and thinking, I'm going to go and drive to a nice lake for the weekend. So I'm going to log on to the Hertz car rental site and rent myself a car, and I'm in Germany. Like nearly every Australian of native Australian birth, I speak only one language, and it's a dialect of English. It usually gets us around the world reasonably simply. But if you go to hertz.com and you're in Germany, it's going to speak German at you. Now, many of you might think, well, of course, that's normal, you're in Germany. But actually, in today's mobile environment, remote work, and the fact that there's such mobility in the world, that's a silly way to look at it, in my opinion, because that tells you only where I am, not what my preferences are. And it's equally disappointing, given that every web client in the world, from a browser to a command line, will communicate its best understanding of the user's preference. And I'm sure everyone who's here today who has an interest in localization knows this already. So I won't spend much time on the idea of the accept language header, other than to note that all of these mechanisms are simply ways to convey user preference. And ultimately, I believe that distilling that down to a BCP 47 language tag, of which you are very familiar, but maybe not know it, is a really good way to communicate what the user's preference is, because it's embedded, it's standard, and it tells you a lot more than you might already think. So what does that mean? Well, here's an example of an accept language header without the header prefix. And you've all seen these things many times. And I have no doubt that many of you have looked at this and said, you know, it's not a bad way to communicate preference, but actually that's complicated to parse. Clients are unreliable in communications when it comes to standardization. I don't really know what I would do with the parsed information when I've got it because I need something to back me up. So I'll basically ignore that much easier if I just go with the IP address. So my first job is to convince you that working with language tags, whether it's accept language or the language tag itself, is practical and meaningful. So here's our example language tag, and it's telling us that my first language preference, at 100% preference, a default of 1.0 weighting, is that I would like to use Chinese as spoken in Taiwan. So that communicates quite a lot of information, as we'll see. And I apologize, not at a weighting of 1, but a weighting of 0.3. If you can't do that, Japanese at a weighting of 1, a weighting of 0.4, I apologize again, or English or Danish, those are all fine. Now, I happen to have a configuration here which has several languages, but does not include Chinese as spoken in Taiwan, but it does include Japanese, English, and Danish. So in using the library to parse that, there's a couple of things I'd like to note. I take a very liberal approach to consuming whatever you can throw with the intent that there is never an exception created, and you will always receive the best possible result given the information at hand. So in parsing an accept language tag, here we can see that what is returned is in decreasing priority order, those parsed language tags, which are identified, and then secondly, which we can work with. And in this case, the notation of validated and canonical simply says validated. I can recognize in the parsing sense of recognize that this is a language tag. And I also have information to back it up. You can use this one. Canonical says, I know what you're asking for, but that's it. I know what you're asking for. I can't fulfill that. But mostly you would end up using here accept language.bestmatch, and it'll return to you the best possible choice that it can make from the information available. So step 1, really easy to identify from a user's preference expressed by accept language, what's the best we can do? And really, that's about all we have to do. I have a number of plugs which take care of all of the mechanics of that, which I can deal with in a separate talk, but accept language.bestmatch is the quickest way to get there. Now, it was really interesting when I started on this journey of looking at internationalization and localization to think I knew what a language tag is. That's the EN or the EN-US or EN_US. And that's all there is. I know the language and I know the territory in order to specify in a more granular detail in the language. So here's my example, EN. Well, it turns out that there is a lot more we can derive from knowing just the language. For example, I can derive from this that the currency that's requested by the user is US dollars. And you're probably thinking, how on earth can that be possible? English is spoken around the world. There is no territory identifier here. Why would that be? And it turns out, like most data repositories, that the Common Locale Data Repository makes the following assumption. If a language is specified without a territory, then the territory is assumed to be that territory with the largest number of native speakers of that language. So in the world as it is today, that's the US. So EN means that we're talking about the territory US and the currency in play is USD. Okay, that's a starting point. We know now a language and a currency just from the language code. I do want to note, however, that in the world of localization, as I'm sure everyone in Europe knows, and hopefully the rest of the world too, country is a political entity, not a geographic one, and introducing politics into applications that are themselves not focused on politics isn't necessarily helpful. There are, it may surprise you to learn, 105 disputed territories around the world, and the countries in red are those countries that are involved as protagonists in one of those disputes. So looking at this, it's pretty clear, nearly everyone's involved in some kind of territory dispute. So calling places countries is not necessarily a good way to engage with an audience. So certainly my firm recommendation, and that which is also applied by the Unicode Consortium, is to refer to territories or regions. And I would similarly say that the mistake many websites make is to use national flags as icons representing languages, and I think that needs to be carefully thought through as well. Okay, so we can derive the currency, as you've worked out. We can derive the territory. Okay, we know quite a lot already. And we can introspect the territory to know important things when we're planning or scheduling. For example, what's the weekday and the weekend? And for this territory, we can see, because we've derived that, it's the US, and we know that the US, like most Western cultures, has 2 days of weekend on Saturday and Sunday. If I was to change this, however, to the country of Iran and reevaluate here, then we'll find out there's only one weekend day. It's a bit confused, so let me do this here, put it in both places. You can see weekend and weekdays, reevaluate, is 1 day of weekend. It's actually on Friday, in common with most Islamic countries, and the rest of it is working time. This is incredibly helpful, and there's no effort whatsoever to now understand underlying the cultural dependencies of what's really important. We can tell, but not surprisingly, that the number system that's used is the Latin number system, the decimal digits 0 through 9. There are 83 different number systems, at least in the base data that I work with, that are known around the world, and each of them can be used, whether they are algorithmic in nature, as the Hebrew numbering system is, or whether they are some form of other digit systems. We can find out what the calendar is, which you might not think is really that important, but even in cultures which use the Gregorian calendar, those calendars don't all have the same behavior. Part of it is because weekdays and weekends are different. In some countries, the assumed start of the week is Monday, and for some countries, it's Sunday. In countries in which we work, live, and play, there might be a civil calendar which rules how we organize birthday parties and go to work, but there's often a financial calendar that determines the tax year in the US that starts at the end of September, or at the beginning of April in some countries, or in July in Australia. So it becomes quite valuable to be able to abstract many forms of calendars, even many forms of the Gregorian calendar, to make it extremely simple then to calculate dates, periods of time, and so on. And it's been one of the most mind-bending journeys through the 6 years of this project so far to learn about calendars and identify how interesting they can be, even to the extent of having to build an astronomical library in order to do lunisolar calendars for Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, solar calendars like the calendar in Iran, and not yet at the Islamic calendars, because they are typically observational and no code can really do that as accurately as is required for those cultures. And I did start a Mars calendar, but I haven't finished that, so any contributions would be welcome. Again, my point being, represent information in the manner to which any user using the system might enjoy. Well, if we know the territory, the language, and the number system, we know the currency. Helpful to know the time zone sometimes, and it won't surprise you to learn we can't really derive the time zone for many countries because there are simply too many. For EN, meaning US, there are 48 time zone IDs. And given, as you would recognize, the territory of the US goes all the way from Hawaii to Alaska, that's not too surprising. It might surprise you to learn that the country, I apologize, the territory that has the most number of time zone identifiers is actually France, which was a surprise to me going through this too, and part of why I do enjoy this so much. Yeah, I can't remember what the number is. Okay, it's going to take me horribly wrong, but Wikipedia will tell me it's actually a really very large number. Oh well, I got that wrong. Wikipedia says there's a lot more than the one that gets derived here. Okay, so I said please don't use flags as icons to represent the choices that a user might make for the preferences they'd like to identify with, because it is important to provide a user interface for users to select what they want. In the US, for example, we probably make the assumption that English is the dominant language, and it is, but 13% of the US population speaks Spanish as their first language. It's one of the fastest growing economic groups, and it's certainly the fastest growing social group. So it is important to be able to display the opportunities for selecting languages in a manner that is complementary to that person. So here, EN translates to English. We can display English in another locale. And I'll try my good French again, first of all, by fixing the errors and reevaluate. And then I'm going to get anglais, which as French speakers will know much better than I do, is the way you say English in French. So in every situation, we want to take what we know about a culture and be able to represent it in another culture, as well as it makes some sense. So we looked at that, and here's the example in German. Well, what else can we know? We can actually know what the measurement system is, and this will become important later when we look at how much of the world around us is described in the context of some measurement system, and how frustrating it is, certainly for me, and best as I understand it for most people, to be presented with shoe sizes, shirt sizes, and clothing, weights and measures in a system which is not the system we're familiar with, or to be told, to be asked your height in feet and inches when you come from a culture which is centimeters or sometimes meters. And therefore, I think actually this is one of the opportunities we have to represent information more relevantly. Okay, US system here. The other two are very gracefully called the imperial system, after the Great British original imperial weights and measure system, and of course the metric system, which most normal people use. That's intended to be Australian humor, and if it didn't work, I apologize, but not too much. So now we know the unit of currency, the territory, the language, that we know the units of measure that we can apply. So we're starting to get from a very simple 2-character identifier, EN, a great deal about what we might think this user is asking us to do from a display and input point of view. And we won't cover the full panoply of opportunities here, because turns out language tags are truly mind-boggling. Here's a language tag, FR-CA-U-CA Gregory, and it goes on and on and on. And this is all standard compliant, legally formed language tag. Well, let's display what that is in English, which is what this code does. And it turns out this is Canadian French transformed from Hindi using the Gregorian calendar with the accounting currency format. So in English locales, that would be putting parentheses around rather than a minus sign. The currency specified is the US dollar. We're going to use the imperial measurement system with Arabic Indic digits. That's unlikely that's what you're going to put on the user interface to allow a user to select. But I do believe that there are ways in which we can create opportunities for users to customize the presentation of data to their interests, actually without having to do too much work on the codes to make that happen. And all of that comes from the Common Locale Data Repository, which is an amazing piece of work that was launched version 1 on the 19th of December 2003, and version 41 was launched just this April. It comes out twice a year. And it's my objective, usually met, but not always, to make sure that EX CLDR libraries are up to date on the same day. And it is fascinating because it is the repository that acts at the intersection of human culture and computing. It's used by every large organization that makes devices and sites around the world. It underpins iOS and Android. It lives at the heart of Windows. It drives probably every major computing platform from a localization point of view that you can imagine. So if that's the case, why aren't enterprise applications typically leveraging this opportunity? And why, in the pursuit of everyday applications, is it not common that we apply these techniques, whether it's this library or another one? And I think it's because, although the ICU library, libicu, has an incredibly complete set of functions, its API is vast because it's either C or Java based, quite complex. And because we live in the Elixir world and in a functional world, in a world that has a very approachable mechanism for delivering easy access to data, I think we've got a better opportunity in Elixir than many other languages. And feedback's always welcome, but I think the libraries have got to a point where they're quite easy to consume what is ultimately quite complex data in a way that's intended to make it easy. So this repository, which is open source, it's on GitHub, easy to find. If you've got a spare rainy day and nothing else to do, take a look. It's amazing. Translations for all sorts of elements of human life and human endeavor that allows data-driven formatting and consumption of information. And most of that's supported today in the CLDR libraries. Collation's not there yet because it's quite complicated, and transliterations isn't there yet, although there's some starting points. And some other areas for me just seem quite optional, but if there's a need, I'm certainly happy to pursue it. Okay, enough talk. Let's get down to how do we do this? Well, I start from the principle again that we're applying a language tag to determine the preferences of a user, and whether that's consumed through an accept language header or through a language tag itself or through other mechanisms, that's how we're going to decide what to do. It can convey a lot of information, the syntax can be convoluted, and there's definitely room to provide better mechanisms for crafting a nice functional approach for building language tags, and I haven't done that yet. And again, contributions are always welcome. Let's start with the basics. CLDR attempts to take a similar path to get text, which means that a common mechanism is to set the locale to be used in effect in the process directory or dictionary, and we do that with cldr.getLocale and putLocale. Deliberately meant to mirror how getText achieves the same results, because I want to make it as easy as possible to bring CLDR alongside getText, and that's the primary purpose. There are plugs to make this easy for web apps, which I'll cover in a separate talk. But for now, let's assume that we're in a position where we're going to take the input here in a text box of a particular language tag, and we're going to use that, put cldr.putLocale for some future work. So let's start now formatting some content. And I go back to the idea of, is there a way that I can format numbers with the right grouping digits? I have a money amount and I need to round it to the right number of digits. How can I make all of that work? Well, this is going to be the shortest section of the whole talk, because ultimately the idea is to apply the same toString mechanism that Elixir uses in the core libraries, but applied to a localized output. And the intent is, if you know how to do type toString, then you can apply the same thing localized. So like getText, we use a backend module that encapsulates the data for the configuration we're after, and then just apply toString to a number, to a date, to a time, to a date time, and even to a list, which turns out to be happy and useful in other applications. And we get a result here that is a default interpretation of the format to be applied for a given culture, language, or territory. So in this case, we're still operating on EN. So let's take the number here and say, okay, I don't want EN, I want, in this case, I want EN-IN. I'll make this a couple of extra digits because it makes it slightly more interesting and appropriate, and reevaluate that. And I've only changed the number. So here we can see the number is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But you'll note that in India, grouping for the first 3 digits is the same as Western formatting, but after that it's digits of 2, the luck and the craw, so 1 by 10 to the 5 and 1 by 10 to the 7 and so on. Quite different formatting, albeit it's, I think, unique in using this formatting. But you'll notice we didn't have to do anything here. I could have updated the process dictionary. In this case, I specified a parameter. I don't have to think about it anymore. There are other ways to do, there are typically for each of these functions, a way to also specify a format, either as a full format mask, and they're very comprehensive in CLDR, but to try and make it a little bit easier, there is the concept of a short, medium, and long, and medium is what's applied by default. So here, we're going to format the date in the English locale, English American, and we're going to format the date here as June the 10th, 2022. So at minimum, unambiguous. And if I was to do that as short, you would see then that we're back to what is most familiar, but is definitely ambiguous in many different locales. The second part coming after the basics are money types. And in fact, the origin of the EX money library was, as much as anything, simply to take advantage of the wide amount of knowledge about currencies that CLDR stores. It knows everything from how to round in territories like Switzerland and Australia, where the cash rounding amount is actually different to the accounting currency amount, in both countries rounded to 5 cents or 5 decimal units when it's cash and rounded to 1 when it's accounting. This becomes incredibly powerful to drive a standards-based way of an appropriate money library. And I'd like to think some of you have used this library before, so you know very well, very similar. Create a money amount, call to string, give it a format and a locale if you want, and you'll get the results appropriate to the locale. So now we've got money, we've got numbers, we've got dates, we've got times, that's taken care of. Parsing is not quite as complete, but there's certainly been many requests to improve parsing, so it gets better in every release, I believe. Here's a case where we've specified $100 and that's been interpreted by parsing to be this amount. This is the new version of the inspect protocol output, following the lead of where the decimal library is going. The inspect output is intended now to be executable code. So that is the inspect output. And there are a number of strings, plural and singular, that are used inside CLDR to format data. And so now that data is being used to parse as well. So we know about the both singular and plural, so that still works out perfectly fine. However, if I was going to parse this in the Danish locale, then not surprisingly, as best as I understand it, people in Denmark don't say US dollar. This is where it's going to get slightly challenging, because I don't speak any Danish whatsoever, but I did manage to recall how to say American dollar in Danish for this demonstration. And so you can see that I've asked to parse this amount as if it's a number in the Danish locale, and I get the same result. And that can apply to any of the 504 different locales that CLDR knows about, and all credit to the very large number of very smart people that contribute the data and audit and validate it over time. It's even possible now to scan a string to actually isolate and identify the numbers. So here's an example. This is a payment of $100. It's just straight up text, and for services rendered. And if that's now scanned with a number scanner, it will break up the string, identify numbers, and then a function called resolve currencies will try to resolve a currency that's either side of a number. So that there's a limited capability to do some document analysis and try and retrieve both numbers and currencies. So all of that's been around for a while in the CLDR libraries. One of the newer additions is units of measure. And units of measure are amazing because there are so many of them. Here's an example where we've created a measure of 1 foot and then 1 meter. We've compared the foot and the meter and discovered that a foot is less than a meter. There's enough intelligence in the unit module to go well beyond the needs of simply doing localization, because you can convert miles per hour to liters per minute. You can define any algebraically possible combination of about 40 different metrics that can be applied to a unit. So we can convert miles per gallon to liters per 100 kilometers. We'd even create units which simply don't exist. So here we're creating a yottapascal ampere per light year gallon, which, as best as I know, is not a standard SI unit, but is derivable algebraically and can then be manipulated, formatted, and printed. And we can even apply unit lengths to have some usages and some others as well, because in many countries, how we measure the length of a person, usually called the height, varies where we are. So if we just said this person is 1.88 meters and said, can you please localize that? And Localise says, based upon the locale you want, convert it to the measurement system most appropriate to that culture, we would get 6.168 feet, but no one refers to that. So localizing it for the US market would say 6 feet 2 inches, which would be a closer indication. So that's all good, but there's a lot still to think about. There's a fair cognitive load involved in thinking about what's that function called, what module does it lie in. So the CLDR.chars protocol intends to mirror the string.chars protocol to make it even easier. So this is almost like the TLDR part of the presentation, which says, put your locale and then just CLDR.string anything you like, because if it's an EX-CLDR type like money or unit, then it will apply the correct output. And if it's a standard Elixir form, it'll simply delegate to the standard Elixir to string. So it's completely safe to call on any standard Elixir type and any CLDR type. And that's really all you have to do at the basic level to get an output that makes sense. In this case, for the German locale, and we've got numbers, dates, money, and units all formatted. And the last part in the 2 minutes that I've allowed myself, which is pretty silly, but that's all on me, is to recognize that we haven't covered messages, which are really get text integration with CLDR, and then database translations, upon which EX-CLDR trans builds on the amazing trans library, all credit due to the trans team, not to me, to make this as easy as possible. So if we have a migration, there are database types that can be applied to an ecto schema that mirror the data types we looked at for units and for money. So here's an example of a person. Here's the migration that makes that happen with the appropriate modules. And that's all running in the system that we're in. So in this case, I can go and retrieve users from my user. I will get the output here, which is, as you can expect, in the inspect format. But I can go through then and localize that. And in fact, as I was building this presentation, I realized this is clunky. So I probably will now go and spend the weekend inventing the CLDR .localized protocol to simplify this. This is more work than it should be. But by localizing the units, we can now produce an output that will give the date in the right format, will give the height in the right format for the locale, and even, given that Helga here is only 6 months old, born this year, smart enough to know that in the EN locale, if you're less than 2 feet tall, typically you're described as being inches long, as opposed to later in life when typically you are taller, referred to as feet and inches. And the underlying data, 5 feet 10 and 6 feet 5, actually, when we looked at the original data here, this was actually stored as one person in 5.9 feet, one person at 1.96 meters, and one person at 26.5 inches. But localization will transform that to whatever locale is required to suit whoever the user is. So I will put that in. And the last part is even allowing for translations. Here's a simple product model in which we can now apply what is this is actually a built-in macro. So there's one macro in the EX-CLDR libraries, which will allow us then very simply, you see, this is a standard ecto query. And all we've said is for the name field, please translate it into whatever the locale is in effect at the time. And in this case, the locale in effect that was specified up here was French. So down here, we've retrieved the French version, and that's it. No having to work really hard to identify how is the translation stored and where do I get it. And that's all taken care of really simply as a translations map in the migration, and using a translations function here that calls the column internally translations. Underneath that, it's actually a structured embedded model. So it's all properly constructed to reflect the configuration you have. And that deserves a lot more time, but I didn't give it any time to myself. So I'm 1 minute over time, lots more to come. In the end, please think about localization as taking good care of your users and presenting them with and consuming information in the format they like. And thanks to everyone here that I wish I could have met. I simply couldn't get to the UK and back fast enough for my schedule. But I really, really love being part of this community. And I thank everyone for making it such a warm place to be part of. And I look forward to the next 6 years. So thank you all very much. 2 minutes late. God, I hate that.
Thanks, Kip. Put that one in. Thanks, Kip. Has anyone got any questions for Kip before we? There we go. 1 second.
Hello, Kip. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I was wondering what you would suggest as an alternative to the flags that we see so often on websites.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I've been searching for that, and the only mechanism that I'm confident overcomes that challenge with flags is the display name. So I have another library you might know, CLDR, HTML. I'm not very creative on library names, but it will take a list of locales that are in your configuration and produce the display names for those locales in the locale itself. So that if you're a Chinese speaker, you'll see it's Chinese in Chinese. But I appreciate that from a UI point of view, that's not very compelling and it's not very visual. And I don't currently have a better idea, but would love to hear one.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for the amazing talk. So I was wondering, you gave a lot of examples in the last part around like changing schemas to then save it in the appropriate unit and format, which to me kind of raised some flags around like breaking the presentation layer concerns into the database and our schemas. I was wondering if you have any thoughts around that, or so. I think it's really cool that you give the opportunity to people who want to do that, but do you have any thoughts on that versus like saving it in always English and then calling like CLDR.toString on the presentation layer?
I think thank you for the question, and it's really good. I am regularly taken to task by Benjamin Mild on this topic, because I'm just a hacky amateur, right? I do this with passion and love, but not necessarily great craft in every situation. So if you can do localization on the client because you're writing an SPA, probably much better to do it on the client. And actually the I-18 library module in JavaScript is based on CLDR. So it's the same data, which is really helpful. And on the back end, yes, I think you're right. From a message point of view, certainly from a message point of view, I don't think it belongs in the database. But I think about an e-commerce catalog, which is really the domain I'm going to follow for the demo app that I eventually get to. And you're talking about a SKU with a name and a description, then I think that data belongs in the database alongside the content. That's a personal view. Others who are far smarter than I probably have a better structured way to defend or not, but that's the way that I think about it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much, Kip. That was brilliant.
Thanks all.